That's perfect. Oh, it's recording already.
The golden age of capitalism was characterized by a multitude of concepts, such as economic growth, which varied around 4% annually, rising incomes creating a much more prosperous middle class. Unemployment was averaging from 4% to 5%, which we all know is ideal for a society's economy. Government policies were being balanced from supporting both private enterprises and public investments. And finally, advancements in technology were being taken far, specifically in fields like aerospace and automobile industries. All of these contributed to a healthy capitalist society.
So, the defining of the middle class. So, during the golden age of capitalism, people were becoming wealthier as a country, and that meant that poverty was dropping sharply. And due to this, there became the emergence of a new class, the middle class. The middle class was defined by its use of consumerism and by the suburban dream. When we hear the nuclear family out in the suburbs, that is the middle class that emerged during this time. They were characterized by their consumerism and by their, not the richest, but also quite comfortable living. Next up, we have the white-collar workers outnumbering blue-collar workers. Now, previous to the 1950s, it had been all about the factory, all about the laborers, the coal miners, the railroad builders, and even during the wars, they'd always needed people in shipyards and in the factories, to build up their stocks. However, with the emergence of the middle class and there not being really a war or a need for that labor anymore, people started to do white-collar jobs, which were a little bit easier. They're more your office jobs, And eventually, by the 1960s, the white-collar jobs actually outnumbered the blue-collar jobs, which had not really been seen before in history.
The GI Bill, also known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, was to provide federal government aid to returning World War II veterans. This included fees, tuition, medical care, and unemployment benefits. Veterans Administration. This is a cabinet-level branch department of the federal government. This provided veterans healthcare, financial assistance, life insurance, and educational benefits. Its mission is to care for those who served in the military and ensure support. How lovely. Consumerism on the rise. Examples would include refrigerators, cars, stoves, televisions, and other household appliances that brought the rise of consumerism during the Eisenhower years, which shaped the economy of the time.
Rise of suburbs, Levittown. Post-World War II, U.S. suburban growth surged due to economic prosperity, car ownership, and government support. Levittown, built from 1947 to 1951, incorporated affordable suburban housing for veterans. President Eisenhower's policies, including the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act and the GI Bill, further promoted suburban living as a central aspect of the American dream.
The baby boom hit America in the mid-1940s and lasted about 2 decades, so until the 1960s. This boom occurred at the end of the war, causing a rise in optimism and economic prosperity, which was the perfect time to have a child. Seeing a chance of changing the world, a man named Dr. Benjamin Spock published the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which encouraged parents to trust their natural instinct and be more nurturing towards raising their children. This caused the well-being of children to grow in popularity compared to previous generations. So, this period in American history represents a transformation in family dynamics and cultural practices.
Growth of the West. The Sun Belt was the rise of population in the West due to the want for economic opportunities, a warm and sunny climate, and a lower cost of living, and a nice little retirement place.
By the 1950s, cars had become such a staple of American society and such a symbol with companies such as Ford and Chrysler. It was a symbol of status for the American middle class, and how rich you are was often exemplified by what type of car you drove. Additionally, in 1956, Dwight D. Eisenhower set up the interstate highway system, which allowed which allowed travelers to navigate from one side of the country to the other on one highway with simplicity, which had not been done before.
Fast food. In the 1950s, the fast food industry boomed due to economic growth, car culture, and service innovations. President Eisenhower's 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, which created the interstate highway system, played a key role by making travel easier and increasing demand for convenient roadside dining. This enabled fast food chains like McDonald's to expand nationally, cementing fast food in American culture.
During the Cold War, there was a very big fear that the Soviets would actually use their nuclear bombs on the United States because they were the other country that was able to use such bombs because they had built them already. And so to ease the fears of some of the citizens, bomb shelters were implanted and they were created. And typically these were shelters that were underground, which were surrounded in cement, and they had supplies down there so that one could withstand the bombs if they were in the shelter. And they were actually used almost everywhere in a lot of cities. And though they actually were never put to use because there was never a bomb dropped, they made a lot of people feel better, and they had some like survival things in there. So like if they did get stuck in there, they could eat and have water and all of that.
Religious reawakening. In the 1950s, the U.S. experienced a religious revival, with increased church attendance and public expressions of faith. President Eisenhower supported this movement, viewing religion as a unifying national force. He endorsed adding "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" to currency, reinforcing America's religious identity during the Cold War.
Okay. Alfred Kinsey. He was the first major sexologist in America, and he was a biologist. His studies led to the publication of sexual behavior. His studies led to the publication of sexual behavior in the human male and sexual behavior in the human female. These two began to challenge the social norms about sex and sexuality and influence the attitudes towards sexual behavior. National Defense Education Act, created in 1958, was a legislation passed act by the United States Congress in response to the Sputnik launch by the Soviet Union. The NDEA wanted to improve the national's defense capabilities in the Cold War by making well-educated Americans.
Collective bargaining caused a reshaping of labor relations. Specifically, labor unions were at an all-time high of members, but of course, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was in place before Ike's presidency, which the act restricted unions from certain strikes and such to limit union power. But this does not mean that the peaceful era wasn't infiltrated by violent strikes. For example, the 1959 steel strike lasted about 116 days and only ended once wages were increased. This time in the era promoted economic stability and growth while also balancing the interest and power of labor unions.
Military-industrial complex is a network that is used to reduce military weapons to, in Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address, guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence.
Okay. The Shelley versus Kramer case was a landmark Supreme Court case which took place in 1948. It occurred when a woman was denied the right to buy a house because the realtors said that they would not sell to a person of color. This case dictated that you could not use race as an excuse not to sell property to someone, and stated that that was a violation of the 14th Amendment.
Pop culture. In the 1950s, American pop culture thrived with the advent of television, rock and roll, and increased consumerism. President Eisenhower's policies promoting economic growth and infrastructure and development fueled this cultural boom. His interstate highway system also enhanced travel and the dissemination of cultural trends, significantly shaping the era's vibrant cultural landscape. Beats. In the 1950s, the Beat generation arose as a countercultural movement focusing on spontaneity, spirituality, and rejecting materialism. This stood stark in contrast to the conformity and prosperity of President Eisenhower's era. The Beats criticized this era's materialism and complexity, highlighting the social tensions and offering an alternative to the dominant culture norms of the time. Urban versus suburban. In the 1950s, Americans increasingly moved from cities to suburbs due to economic prosperity, affordable homes, and car ownership. President Eisenhower's 1956 Federal Highway Act, which created the interstate highway system, made suburban areas more accessible, supporting this shift. This migration embodied the American dream, highlighting a contrast between busy urban life and growing, family-focused suburbs. Urban immigrants. During the 1950s, cities in the U.S. experienced an increase in immigrant populations seeking economic prospects. President Eisenhower's policies, including the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, addressed both economic necessities and national security interests. Amid the Cold War, my Chromebook just died. This era witnessed attempts to integrate immigrants into American culture while managing the demographic changes in urban areas.
Changing roles of women were starting to take much deeper involvement. Though many women were expected to stay home as housewives instead of going out and working, many women took on the task of both, especially since to maintain the rich standard of living at the time, a second income was needed for many homes, despite the prosperity of the era. Many of these factors led women to push for further education opportunities and more civil rights movements, especially to push back against the stigma around traditional domestic roles for women. So this era of time not only reinforced traditional gender roles, but also set the stage for feminist movements for the world's future.
The thaw was after Joseph Stalin's death. It relieved the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. I can't pronounce this name, bro. This Khrushchevich. We should leave us struggling with that word.
Go!
Took over and more or less de-Stalinized the Soviet Union.
The kitchen debate occurred at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, showcasing American goods. This was a debate about capitalism versus communism, discussed by Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Nixon's argument revolved around the emphasis of American quality and abundance of consumer goods, the advancements in technologies making American lives easier, and highlighted the strengths of freedom and individualism that came with capitalism. Now, Khrushchev's arguments revolved around the Soviets' heavy industry in which it was believed that the consumer's goods would follow after. The Soviets were also only waiting for the perfect chance to surplus American technologies, and Khrushchev advocated for the well-planned out economy and collective welfare that came with communism. My bad.
Nikita Khrushchev was a diplomat who was working to bring peace between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. He believed that for the two big superpowers of the world to get into a fight would just lead to destruction and blood loss, which was unnecessary. In addition to trying to work things out between the two superpowers, he was also crucial to the building of the Berlin Wall.
In the hydrogen bomb, Eisenhower's foreign policy strategy was to explain that any Soviet Union attack could end in the United States using nuclear weapons. This was to help prevent Soviet expansion. He also used diplomatic efforts to help reduce the risk of nuclear war and bring peace. One of the programs was called Atoms for Peace.
Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD, was actually one of the big reasons why there was never an official war between the Soviet Union and the United States. MAD is the understanding that when one country attacks with nuclear weaponry, the other country is just going to retaliate with nuclear weaponry. So attacking with nukes would actually just not do anything because it would just lead to more and more destruction, and destruction on both fronts, leaving them still on equal footing.
Massive retaliation was an essential part of the U.S. military strategy at the time. The strategy was threatening the Soviet Union with a nuclear attack to dissolve some of the Soviets' aggression during the Cold War. This strategy was introduced by the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. He announced the strategy because massive retaliation with nuclear weapons was believed to be much more cost-effective. This increased focus on developing and testing many different nuclear weapons. Though the strategy seemed dandy at the time, criticism still creeped in, especially relating to the lack of flexibility. Was the U.S. supposed to rely on nuclear weapons for every little disagreement it had? Is that really not too excessive? The U-2 spy plane was an aircraft developed by the CIA and Lockheed Martin. It was designed to specifically fly an altitude of 70,000, which was just out of reach of the Soviets' air defenses. Such planes were sent over Soviet camps in order to collect secrets. On May 1st, 1960, one of the planes was shot down and captured by the Soviet Union. The U.S. tried to cover the mission up with a lie about it being a weather survey plane, but unfortunately, the Soviets had proof of espionage activities. The incident caused the U.S. and Soviet diplomatic relationship to become even more tense throughout the Cold War.
The domino effect was a part of the United States foreign policy against communism. It stated that for every time a non-communist state fell in place of communism, another non-communist state would fall near it. And this was actually used to justify defending Turkey and Greece because they believed that since the neighboring countries had fallen subject to communism, Turkey and Greece were going to be next, and they wanted to preserve the rest of Europe. The Sputnik was the small satellite that the USSR sent into space in 1957, which spurred on the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Though the Soviet Union was the first to make the move into space, Dwight D. Eisenhower was very optimistic for our future, and he took this as a sign to keep pushing forward and to beat them, and kind of instilled a little bit of competition between the United States and the USSR.
The Bretton Woods system was established in 1944, framing around international economic cooperation. This involved fixed exchange rate, so every ounce of gold would be convertible to about 35 US dollars. U.S. leadership is what caused the U.S. dollar to become the primary reserve. The Bretton Woods system resolved around the stability of the economy's environment, causing trade and growth to increase through. Though it didn't last long because the U.S. relied too heavily on gold reserves to support the U.S. dollar's convertibility, but unfortunately, the gold did drain out. That made no fucking sense, and I'm sorry, but I'm not changing it. Hopefully cut this out.
World Bank. The World Bank, founded in 1944, aimed to aid global reconstruction and development post-World War II. President Eisenhower backed its mission, seeing international development as a vital for stability and countering communism during the Cold War. His administration collaborated with the World Bank to finance infrastructure projects and economic development worldwide, promoting global prosperity and influence.
The International Monetary Fund was established in 1944, just as the Bretton Woods system was. But the fund focused on post-war reconstruction and stabilization of exchange rates. Its main focus was to help other countries stabilize their currencies through financial assistance programs like standby arrangements and extended fund facilities.
Thanks for watching.